Hey guys, so for today's video, I am going to be testing out the Wet n Wild Rosé in the Air palette, and I'm gonna see if it's a possible dupe for the Modern Renaissance palette from Anastasia. The Wet n Wild palette retails for $5 and you get 10 shades in this. This palette retails for $42. You get 14 shades in it, 14 gorgeous shades, but I wanted to see if this can be a possible dupe for it because I've actually been looking for a good dupe for that palette from the drugstore, and I'm really hoping this one lives up to the test. I'm going to be showing you guys swatch comparisons from this palette as opposed to this palette to see which colors are the most similar. And yeah, just so I stop rambling on, let's go ahead and jump into it. I swear I think that's crooked. It's going to keep bugging me. Ugh, I can't tell. I feel like that's straighter. Dang it. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and do a swatch comparison of the two palettes first, just so you guys can see which shades from the Wet n Wild palette are the most similar to the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette. The Anastasia shades have names, the Wet n Wild ones do not, so I'm gonna be showing you guys up close which colors from this palette and then which colors from that palette, just so you guys know. The Wet n Wild palette is going to be on this side here, and the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette is gonna be on this side, just so you guys know, just so there's no confusion. So the first shade in the Wet n Wild palette is called Transition. It's a very light taupey brown color, and I find it's the most similar to the shade Warm Taupe in the Anastasia palette. I find that Warm Taupe from the Anastasia palette is just a little bit more pigmented, and it's also just a tiny bit darker than the shade Transition from the Wet n Wild Rosé in the Air palette. So the next shade in this Wet n Wild palette is this Eggshell Cream white color. This is the one shade from the Wet n Wild palette that I had a hard time finding could match with a shade from the Modern Renaissance palette. I found the only shade in the Modern Renaissance palette that it would be the closest to would be the shade Golden Ochre. And as you guys can see, Golden Ochre is actually a lot warmer and has more of a yellow undertone, whereas the shade from the Wet n Wild palette, it's a lot more of like an eggshell and it's not as pigmented as Golden Ochre. The next shade in the Wet n Wild palette I found extremely similar to the shade Real Gar from the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette. They're both a very warm burnt orange color. With them, honestly, the only difference I found was that the Anastasia one was a little bit less crumbly, and it was also just a pinch more pigmented than the one from Wet n Wild. The next shade in the Wet n Wild palette is this golden shimmer shade. I found it looks the most similar to the shade Primavera from the Modern Renaissance palette. I honestly found no difference swatching these shades. It had the exact same pigmentation, and the colors honestly look identical to me. This next shade from the Wet n Wild palette, I found it the closest to the shade Red Ochre from the Anastasia palette. I honestly found barely any difference when swatching these shades. The colors look exactly the same to me, and the pigmentation is almost close. Red Ochre is just a tiny bit more pigmented when swatching as opposed to the Wet n Wild shade. So this next shadow from the Wet n Wild, I found it to be extremely similar to the shade Bon Fresco in the Modern Renaissance palette. In the pan, I thought they looked identical. However, as soon as I swatched them, as you can tell here, Bon Fresco was clearly a lot more pigmented than the shadow from Wet n Wild. The next shade in the Wet n Wild palette I found was extremely similar to the shade Love Letter from the Anastasia palette. I honestly saw no big difference when swatching them either. I felt like they looked totally identical and felt almost exactly the same when swatching. The Anastasia one was just a tad more pigmented as soon as I swatched it, but as you can see from here, there really is no big difference. They're both extremely pigmented and the colors look almost identical. The next shade from the Wet n Wild palette I found to be the most similar to the shade Antique Bronze from the Modern Renaissance palette. As soon as I swatched these, the Antique Bronze one was definitely the one that was the most pigmented. The colors, however, look exactly the same. The only difference is that the one from Wet n Wild isn't quite as pigmented as the one from the Modern Renaissance palette. The next shade in the Wet n Wild palette, I found it was the most similar to the shade Cypress Umber from the Modern Renaissance palette. When I swatched them, Cypress Umber was the one that came out a bit more pigmented, just a little bit darker than the one from the Wet n Wild palette as well. And then the last shade in the Wet n Wild palette I found was the most similar to the shade Raw Sienna from the Modern Renaissance palette. Surprisingly, the one from the Wet n Wild palette was actually a bit more pigmented than the one from the Modern Renaissance palette, which was a huge shock for me because I didn't see that through most of the shades here. Alright, got my hair out of my face again. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a look using both palettes. I'm gonna do one palette on this side and then the other palette on this side. All right, I went ahead and zoomed you guys into my ugly mug so you could be a little bit closer. All right, I'm going to be taking my handy dandy Morphe E30 brush. You could use any regular fluffy brush for this. I'm just gonna go ahead and start with my transition shade. And I think the transition shade I wanna jump into first. I'm gonna dip into the shade Raw Sienna from the Modern Renaissance palette. I'm just gonna go ahead and swipe this all across my crease. All right, went ahead and cleaned off that brush. Now I'm going to be dipping into the shade that I found was the closest to Raw Sienna in the Wet n Wild palette. This one is definitely more pigmented, which I figured from the swatch. I kind of wanted it to be a little bit lighter, but that's okay. It's good that it's pigmented. As you guys can see, this shade from the Wet n Wild palette is clearly a lot more pigmented than the shade in the Anastasia palette. Now from the Modern Renaissance palette, I'm going to be dipping into the shade Love Letter. And I'm going to be focusing this shade pretty much all over my lid. Gonna dip back into that shade Raw Sienna and just buff this out and blend it. Using my Morphe M433 brush, I'm gonna dip into that shade that I found the closest to Love Letter in the Wet n Wild palette. Gonna go ahead and use it on the Wet n Wild side now. See if it's as pigmented. Right off the bat, it's not as pigmented. I don't mind that because I kind of like being able to build up shadows. I feel like this palette is probably better for beginners though, because when something is like off the bat pigmented, it's a lot harder for someone that's like newer with makeup to figure out how to blend it out. And honestly, I like building up the color more too, so I kind of like that about it. But once you really build this up, it's starting to look the same, as you can see. For $5 though, this is not bad. Pigmentation wise, this is actually really good. Gonna go ahead and dip into that transition shade that was most similar to Raw Sienna in the Wet n Wild palette and just blend that out. These honestly blend out so nicely, the Wet n Wild shadows, you guys. I'm actually extremely impressed. I'm now going to dip into the shade Red Ochre from the Anastasia palette. Same exact thing that we did with that shade Love Letter. I'm going to put this pretty much all over my lid, but I'm going to keep it a little bit lower in my lid because I really do want that shade Love Letter to shine through. I just wanted a little bit of red with this. And I'm really gonna blend this out. Gonna go back into Raw Sienna one more time for the Modern Renaissance palette, and again blend that out, just so we have no harsh lines. All right, cleaned off my brush again. Now I'm gonna dip into that shade from the Wet n Wild palette that was the most similar to the shade Red Ochre, and same exact thing, blend this all over my lid, but keep it a little bit lower on the lid. Wow, not a huge difference when it comes to pigmentation, you guys. These are actually really freaking good. I'm gonna dip into that transition shade again from Wet n Wild. I'm gonna get it very lightly because it's a lot more pigmented than the other one, and just drag that across. As you guys can see up close, I don't know if you guys can tell here, but there's a little bit more fallout from the Anastasia shadows than there are from the Wet n Wild shadows. So if any of you guys have an issue with fallout, the Wet n Wild shadows have pretty much zero fallout, which is awesome, just as a side note. I don't have an issue with fallout, but I know some people do, so I just thought I would mention it. Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm so excited with the way this eye is turning out. I honestly see like no difference here. That's freaking crazy. Oh my god, I'm excited right now. All right, now for my inner corners, I'm going to be dipping into the shade Primavera from the Modern Renaissance palette, and I'm gonna use it as an inner corner highlight. I'm gonna put it right on my inner corner and kind of drag it out a little bit. Now I'm gonna grab the shade from the Wet n Wild palette that I found was the most similar, and exact same thing, put it right on my inner corner. Wow, this actually came off a little bit more pigmented right off the bat. Wow, you guys, I'm seeing no difference. If anything, this one came off a little bit more pigmented and had a little bit less fallout. All right, you guys, and as you can see, they honestly look extremely similar. I'm looking up close here now, and I'm really seeing no difference at all. When it came to blending them out and the pigmentation, there was barely any difference. The only shade I noticed a difference with was the shade Love Letter, and as I built up that color, it started to look exactly the same. I'm gonna go ahead and finish up my eyes now. I'm gonna go ahead and do my bottom lash line. Just so you guys know what I did at the top, I'm gonna do the exact same thing on the bottom. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish up my eyes, and I will be right back. Hey you guys, so this is the final eye look right here. As you can see, I saw while applying my falsies and also applying my eyeliners that I saw no difference whatsoever However, the Wet n Wild shadows blended out just as well. They were almost as pigmented. Obviously, I just had to build up some of the colors more to make them a little bit more pigmented. But other than that, you guys, they are amazing. And for $5, you honestly can't complain about that. Now, my thoughts as opposed to the Modern Renaissance palette. Now, obviously, the price point is extremely different, but here's what you also gotta look at. The packaging on this is obviously completely different. This is pretty standard drugstore packaging, and what's inside is absolutely amazing, and the shadows blended out so beautifully. This one comes with 14 shades, and this one comes with 10 shades. This one comes with a lot more in the pan, though. That's what I see the difference here, and I can understand why this one is $42. I can kind of justify it because the packaging is outstanding. Obviously, there's a huge difference with the packaging. It also comes with a brush, and then it also comes with a mirror as well. And then this one, obviously the packaging is much different. However, for $5, this is amazing. I'm not gonna complain about it whatsoever. I can honestly say so far, this is a fantastic dupe for the Modern Renaissance palette by Anastasia. I'm gonna come back in a few hours and show you guys how everything wore and let you guys know my final thoughts. Alright, you guys, I've had a proper wear test. I've had a bit to drink. It is now 10:40. I've had this makeup on for about 8 hours, which I think is a proper wear test. I'm about to tell you guys my final thoughts on this. The Modern Renaissance palette, here's the thing. The packaging is a lot nicer. There's a lot more pan in the shadows. It comes with a brush, comes with more shades, also comes with a mirror. So if you're looking for something a little bit more sleek, I still highly recommend this palette. I honestly do think it is 100% worth the money. It's $42. And it honestly is a fantastic palette. However, if you are looking for something cheaper with still amazing quality shadows for only $5, the shadows in this, you guys, are honestly fantastic. As you can see, they both look exactly the same. I am seeing no difference here whatsoever in the pigmentation and the longevity of the shadows. So if you guys are looking for something a lot cheaper and exactly like the Modern Renaissance palette color-wise and pigmentation-wise, I highly suggest this palette. I have no complaints about it whatsoever. Certain shadows weren't quite as pigmented, but when you build them up, they can be. Anyway, is the Rosé in the Air palette a perfect dupe for the Modern Renaissance palette? Yes. Those are my final thoughts on that. I can honestly say the colors were almost exactly the same and they were both fantastic. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you guys haven't already, and have a great rest of your night or day wherever you guys may be. I will see you guys in my next video. And remember, stay weird, my friends. Bye, guys.